Georgian townhouses on the moon.
The highest GDP per capita in the Milky Way.
Small modular reactors under every village green.
This is Anglo-futurism.
Welcome back to the King Charles III Space Station. I'm Tom Ough.
And I'm Calum Drysdale. And if you, our listeners, have a telescope handy, you might be able to see our orbital space pub speeding southwards. Tom's behind the bar with one hand on our ship's wheel and the other one clutching a pint of gin.
Listeners, you can't see the wheel, but let me assure you that it's fashioned of beautiful English oak. A perfect replica of the wheel on HMS Victory.
Tom, tell me where you're taking us.
Well, take a look through that mullion's porthole we put in the floor.
Yep, taking a look.
What do you see?
I see the Falklands to the west.
Yeah.
South Georgia, and I think that must be the South Sandwich Islands to the east.
Yeah.
And now it's a long, rocky peninsula.
Yeah, an enormous, apparently inhospitable peninsula.
And yet, something about it feels like home.
Correct. As we sweep over this frozen continent, you will need no reminding that we are looking over the British Antarctic Territory. I will stop the ship here.
Listeners, the view is stunning. Mile upon mile of white wilderness with the southern lights dancing above it. But Tom, maybe you can tell the listeners why you've brought us here.
Well, in short, what we're looking at is Britain's most valuable overseas possession. It could be the ticket to a new age of British prosperity, but it's under threat. And I think it's high time the country pay the matter some attention.
Well, I think it's something that we often forget, right? In that it's notable when, or maybe not so notable to some people, when we try to rid ourselves of a few tiny atolls in the Indian Ocean. But actually the idea that we own a whole sort of section of a slice of a continent is maybe even less well known.
Yeah, and let's put this in perspective, because the Chagos Islands, important as they are pretty minuscule in terms of landmass, whereas the British Antarctic Territory is about 8 times the size of Great Britain. It's insane. It's absolutely enormous. And I think it's high time the country paid the matter some attention.
I think it's a bit risky, Tom, isn't it? Because the more attention we draw to our overseas territories, the greater risk that the FCDO tries to find someone to foist them off on.
Yeah, I do worry about this, because I think our claim to the Antarctic Territory is in fact weaker than our claim to the Chagos Islands. So if you are listening and you are a senior civil servant at the FCDO, then please avert your ears. But we are going to do an episode on the British Antarctic Territory nevertheless.
And our first one without a guest, as seemingly, Tom, you are appointing yourself as our resident expert in the field.
Well, there is a criminal dearth of enthusiasts about the British Antarctic Territory. And I hope listeners will, over the next half hour or so, come to understand why I think there's a dearth.
Whilst most people are going out to the pub and talking to women, what on earth have you done spending your time worrying about the British Antarctic Territory?
I, for one, got nerd snipes by the BAT, as they call it, last year, when a big oil and gas discovery was made in the waters surrounding it. And that led me to look into the BAT, to which I had not given much thought prior to that. And I discovered that it's enormous. It could be very lucrative. It's very exciting. It's a frontier. And there's an amazing British history there as well. And perhaps we can get into all of those over this conversation.
Well, absolutely. So, I mean, do you want to start us off, Tom? Why on earth do we own a slice of this icy pie?
There's a story to this which explains why we make the claim, and I think we can get into that very soon. But I think it's worth winding back a little further, because Antarctica has a fascinating, very recent history. Ancient and medieval cartographers hadn't been there. They nevertheless assumed that because of all the landmass that they're aware of north of the equator, that there would be a continent in the far south to counterbalance that land in the north. So that's not really evidence in favour of Antarctica existing, but nevertheless, a picture began to build, and we had 17th century sailors coming home with stories of islands of ice trailing through empty seas.
I mean, the counterweight stuff is funny, right? Because actually, there isn't really a continent down there. That most of the land on the globe is concentrated to the north. There isn't much reason really to go, and I suppose the Southern Ocean around Antarctica is so empty that actually it's quite an inhospitable place for a wooden-hulled ship to go.
Yeah, I mean the seas around there are full of ice. They're very stormy. there's a prevailing west wind that rushes clockwise around the continent, dragging this very strong currents along beneath. So not only is it freezing, it's also a very difficult place to navigate. So you can sort of understand why nobody discovered Antarctica sooner than they did. But nevertheless, people were interested.
And there was a sense that there had to be something there, right? Like you weren't just venturing out into open ocean.
Well, it's almost a little spooky, because if you look at some of the old maps, they will even insert a large southern continent called Terra Australis Nondum Cognita, which means the southern land not yet known. And so we had French sailors, Dutch sailors, English sailors, including Francis Drake, who all went on a hunt for this continent, didn't find anything.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting you talk about this unknown southern and counterweight continent, as I think Terry Pratchett put it. That when I've heard that term before, it's always been in reference to Australia, right, and Cook's expeditions down south.
Yeah, well, Cook's a very important figure here, and the background is that in 1768 he was chosen to lead an expedition chosen by the Royal Society, and its putative purpose was to observe the transit of Venus. And the idea was that if the transit of Venus were monitored from various points on the surface of the globe, the Astronomer Royal could accurately determine the distance between the planets. So that, as I say, was the putative purpose of that mission in 1768. And they do it. Cook's in Tahiti. And then in June 1769, still in Tahiti, he opens an envelope which he'd carried with him on the ship all the way from London, and it contains secret instructions from King George III.
I mean, this is the sort of thing that you read about in kind of Cold War spy thrillers, isn't it? That the dour Soviet commander gets under the into the Northwest Passage, opens the letters, "Bomb Vancouver immediately, comrade captain."
But it is, in fact, even better. The secret instructions were for a second mission, and the mission was to find this mysterious southern continent, Terra Australis, and claim it for Britain.
Which we love to hear.
We love it. And so he sets out to find Terra Australis. And so he finds New Zealand, he finds Australia, and fabulously none of his crew dies of scurvy because he's a wonderful captain, but no Terra Australis. And so Cook returns home.
Really? So he was always looking for Antarctica?
He was looking for Antarctica. Yeah, he was looking for an even more southerly continent. I'd say he did pretty well. I'd say he discovered a continent, just happened to be the wrong continent. I'm not saying we should tear down all his statues and burn all the stamps bearing his face.
So Australia found, still impressive. We're not cancelling Cook yet.
Yeah. I think we can give him a pass, but he does not give himself a pass. He goes on another expedition. And so this is 1773 now, and 1774, and his ships entered the Antarctic Circle several times. And it was, as I say, incredibly cold there, as you can imagine. And this means that they had to turn back when they were merely 121 kilometers from Antarctica's coast.
And is this because it's so cold that the sailors can't survive, or is it because almost like stepping onto a conveyor belt that they start just being whizzed around the globe, sort of sent careening off westwards, that they have to withdraw?
Well, I think we can turn to his own diary entry. I, who had ambitions not only to go farther than anyone had done before, but as far as it was possible for man to go, was not sorry at meeting with this interruption. So I think we can infer from that none of the crew wanted to be there. Even Cook, one of the most adventurous seafarers in British history, was like, oh my God, I really want to warm my hands on a fire somewhere.
Well, it's like that, the clip of Fernando Alonso coming up behind Schumacher. I can't remember which Grand Prix it was. And he's racing at his back end. And he says famously in the post-race interview, I knew he was going to move. He's got a wife and children waiting for him at home.
Okay, I'm going to give you a fun fact about Cook. He was married at 34. He was at sea for more than half his married life, yet he still had 6 children.
It's good going.
Get a move on. Get a move on, Calum.
Okay, so Cook can't cut it. Our great explorer, yet defeated by a bit of wind and a bit of a nip in the air.
Yeah, so Cook scuttles home with his tail between his legs, and it's such difficult sea to navigate that it's another 40 years till something really significant happens in this endeavour to find this mystery continent. And what happens is that the commander of the first Russian Antarctic expedition, whose name is Fabian Bellingshausen,
which doesn't strike me as a particularly Russian name.
No, nor me. It's all very sus. And what is more sus is that his manuscript chart shows a patch of blue at the lower edge. And that is said to be the first departure from blank space on those maps near the pole, because that could very well be a sign of a continent.
And are we sure that he didn't just spot a significantly sized ice floe or, particularly large seal or something like that?
Well, we will get to that, but not 2 days after Bellingshausen's sighting of that little patch of blue, an officer in the British Royal Navy, Edward Bransfield, saw something else. And I'll give you a bit of background on the great Edward Bransfield. He was born in Cork. He was press-ganged at the age of 18 into joining the Navy. He went through the ranks, and at 34 or so, he was posted to the Navy's new Pacific Squadron off Valparaiso.
Is that how you pronounce it?
In Chile. Yeah, I believe so. Our Chilean listeners who will be very angry about this episode as it is because of the contested claim in the Antarctic can correct me. But Bransfield on 30th of January 1820, which, as I say, was 2 days after Bellingshausen's sighting, saw Trinity Peninsula, which is the northernmost point of the Antarctic mainland.
Which we are now hovering above.
Which we are hovering above right now. And so the Russians had this claim to have seen it first. But from the 1960s, there was some Cold War revisionism, in which I think it was British scientists who said, well, actually, Fabian Bellingshausen did not see the continent. He just saw some sea ice.
I'm glad that my sort of inherent chauvinism lines up with 1960s British scientists' attitudes.
So Edward Bransfield is a hero, and we saw it first. Yeah. Is I think what we're thrusting towards. But sadly, people did not realise the significance of this at the time, it would seem. In 2000, the Royal Mail wanted to issue a commemorative stamp in Bransfield's honour. But nobody knew what his face looked like. Nobody had painted a portrait of this guy. So unfortunately, the stamp depicted instead RRS Bransfield, which was a surveying vessel named after him.
Well, I had an English teacher at school who was called Ben Bransfield. I wonder if he was a relative thereof. I remember him being particularly rosy-cheeked, as sort of a man who I think would do well in cold weather.
I guess we'll never know because this age of exploration is over. Or is it?
Beautifully teed up there, Tom.
Well, I do. Before we get on to present-day Antarctica, I do want to talk about what is called the heroic era. And this is an amazing era in British exploration. And it's roughly the first 2 decades of the 19th century. And at this point, people in lots of the sort of advanced countries at that time were getting interested in this continent, which, as I say, was seen first by a Briton. And so people were scrambling expeditions, and it was a very exciting time.
I think what's notable as well, I mean, I have to say, I was struck when I was reading your notes of this is happening the beginning of the 20th century. So there have been ships rounding the Cape to India for centuries at this point, and yet that barrier of these cold and windy seas south of the Cape was so great that even the sort of great tea clippers of the time, when you go and see the Cutty Sark, which is this astonishingly beautiful and seemingly very high-tech ship, that even those were not enough to brave these terrifying seas.
Yeah, well, let me give you an example of this. There was a Belgian ship, the imaginatively named Belgica, which was sent forth in 1897 or so, and it accidentally became the first vessel to winter in Antarctic waters just because it got trapped in pack ice.
Which won't be the last boat to do so.
No, the first in a long line of vessels to be trapped in pack ice. There's a new body set up in Britain, the British National Antarctic Expedition, and there's this guy called Robert Falcon Scott, friend of the show, who on board the Discovery sets a new record for reaching the farthest point south. People are now exploring the landmass, which is very exciting.
So this is further south than the Belgica gets?
Well, they didn't land. Oh,
but he does.
Yeah,
actually.
But they didn't land. Scots and others are now actually on the landmass.
So he's the first.
Well, in fact, he wasn't only on the landmass; he also hovered above it in a tethered balloon for air reconnaissance, which is something that's tragically missing from the accounts of Scott's daring do.
A predecessor of our own, then, as we too hover above the.
We're not tethered, but it was a view not unlike ours.
So he was the first. He was the first man, or his crew were the first people to land on the Antarctic.
They were early. There were other expeditions coming from places like France, Germany, and Sweden. And the race is, at this point, is not so much to get on the continent as to get to the South Pole itself.
I fear I know the answer to this, Tom, but was it a Brit? Was it a Briton who reached the South Pole first?
Well, it seemed like it might be for a while. Robert Falcon Scott led this expedition with a 5-man party, and they were racing for the South Pole, and they were racing the Norwegian crew led by Roald Amundsen. And after this incredibly arduous journey, the Englishmen thought they'd got there, or they thought they'd won, and the South Pole itself was hoving into view, and then they saw the fluttering flag of Norway and a tent, and that had been left by Amundsen's crew, and he'd left a letter for Scott saying, like, well done, better luck next time, basically, and like, please pass on this letter to the King of Norway, which I think Scott found quite patronising. And so they had their little squares of chocolate that they'd apportioned for what they hoped would be this momentous point. And they had to set off. They had to start setting off home. And this was an 800-mile journey. And it was torturous, and very sadly, all 5 of Scott's party died from cold and hunger.
This is the famous Captain Oates. I'm stepping out, and I may be some time.
Sacrificing himself for the sake of the other men, knowing that there was not enough food to sustain them all. And there were three men left, and they continued for another 20 miles in what must have been horrible conditions. And unfortunately, they didn't make it either. And the really sad thing is that they were just 11 miles from the next food and fuel depot. There was a search party sent out, and they found the bodies of Scott and 2 other men on the expedition, Dr. Wilson and Bertie Bowers, and they were just in their sleeping bags inside a tent covered with snow. Journals and papers were recovered, but the bodies were left in Antarctica, and Captain Oates' body is still there, I suppose, because it was never found. And because of that recovery mission, as I say, we have the journals left by Scott and his men. And that means we have Scott's final diary entry. And he knows that the depot is 11 miles away. He says, but outside the door of the tent, it remains a scene of whirling drift. I do not think we can hope for any better things now. We shall stick it out to the end, but we are getting weaker, of course, and the end cannot be far. It seems a pity, but I do not think I can write more. Ask Scott, for God's sake, look after our people.
Both awful, but heroic as well.
Yeah, awful and heroic. And so the torch of Great British Antarctic exploration passes on to a man called Ernest Shackleton. And Ernest Shackleton is an enormous personal hero of Calum's.
Yes, Shackleton is often accused because, of course, his mission was a failure, but they managed to get back alive, and I think his combination of daring do and, frankly, horrendous and even dangerous amateurism appeals to me.
We can fill this out a bit. Tell the listeners about the Weddell Sea.
I think, yeah, well, Shackleton after the victory of Amundsen, Shackleton goes forward and tries to carry the torch of British Antarctic exploration. And so he sets out in the Endurance in early 1915, and his aim is to not only reach the South Pole but then go across it. And this is obviously more difficult because you can't retreat to the caches and the storage depots that you've left along the way. Instead, you're always crossing unknown terrain. And I think if you imagine Antarctica as one of the horseshoe crabs whose blood is harvested en masse for pharmaceutical products, with a tail, and it is into this tail that he comes in, the Weddell Sea. And in 1915, they arrive, and wend their way in between floes and icebergs. But in January 1918, in January 1915, the ship is stuck and is stuck fast. First, spirits seem high, and they attempt to, after a month, manually cut their way out. So they're cutting holes in the ice with big saws and picks, trying to create a space, and they move the ship back and then try to effectively ram their way back out to open water so that they can continue their journey. And they get within 400 feet of open water before they realise that some of this ice is 18 feet thick and there is no way that they can reach water. So they have to settle in and accept that this is going to be their winter station, and they are going to, like the Belgica before them, winter in the pack ice. And I think that when people talk about this, it's difficult to grasp the sheer scale of the time periods that we're talking about here. That first, these men are in the ship and they're bored. There's nothing to do. They have to just survive over the winter. And they play football. They put on cabarets and variety shows. They name the lower berth the Ritz, and put on variety shows with dressing up. Scott actually wins an award for worst singer.
It sounds a lot like Lockdown.
In many ways it is. And
My housemates and I were in a 5-bed house at that point, and we did a bar crawl, and all the guys turned their room into a themed bar, and it was fantastic.
Well, and I think doing things like this is really important because the men are bored, but he's absolutely ferocious disciplinarian. So he maintains the spirits of the crew by keeping to a really rigorous routine of scrubbing the ships. They have more than 50 dogs on board, which are meant to act as pack dogs, who the mess and the smell must have been awful. And what's astonishing as well is they had a photographer with them. They had Frank Hurley, who is capturing video and photographs of these early games of football on the ice, of variety shows of singing, that are astonishing watching, given how distant these people are and actually yet how close they become through the footage.
Yeah, I really recommend looking up this footage. This is incredible that they captured it at that early stage.
And then, so we're 3 months in, they've been stuck in the ice for 3 months, and now the ice starts buckling. So the pressure starts building up and starts buckling around them. So the hull of the ship is sort of 3 feet thick, but the fears start to mount that even this powerful ship is not going to be able to manage. And their original idea at this point is that they're going to sit in the ice, and the pack ice is always moving. It's floating, and they want to get to a supply depot that was being left from a previous expedition on Paulet Island. And they've originally made an effort to get there with dogs on sleds moving through the ice, but it's just impossible. The ice is forming mountains and ridges that are impassable. And so they have to wait. 6 months in, the hull starts really giving way and the rudder is broken, so there's no way now that the ship will work. And they take their supplies off the ship. 9 months in, the ship keels over 30 degrees, and the ship is now tilting. There's a fear that it's going to give way. 9.5 months in, the order is given to abandon ship, and Shackleton tells his men, "Ships and stores are gone. We will go home." So the mission is now impossible. There's no attempt going to be made. And now they're hoping that, as I said, that they will drift close enough to Paulet Island to be able to find these stores and survive, and then an attempt to rescue. But unfortunately, the ice flow is unpredictable, and they move too far to the northeast, and they watch Paulet Island pass in front of them, inaccessible, but the opportunity of survival is there. And so now we're 14 months in, and Shackleton abandons the Paulet Island, and he says to the men, the only thing we can do now is go for this different place, Elephant Island. And Elephant Island, there's no supplies on Elephant Island, but at least it's out of the ice. You'd be out, and you could actually attempt to connect to South Georgia, which is the closest human and occupied territory. And the conditions at this point are awful. We're 14 months in, and the men have been eating largely meat, so anything they can scavenge. So they're down to a biscuit for lunch and 3 sugar cubes a day, and they're eating seal steaks, stewed seal, stewed penguin steaks.
Keto.
I mean, their breath must have stunk. I mean, just disgusting. Although the men talk very highly, apparently, of penguin livers as a real delicacy.
I can see that becoming very popular on Instagram.
And at this point, they have to kill the dogs. So these dogs who have become like pets and really close companions are killed 14 and a half months in. And then soon after, the ice floe breaks apart, and suddenly their camp starts splitting in two, where the ice where they've been on starts splitting in two, and the crew, all 27 of them, take to the sea in these 3 tiny lifeboats. I mean, these are 23-foot long open boats, and after 6 days at sea, I mean, storms the whole way through, as you said. These are not hospitable waters. They land on Elephant Island, and this is the first time in 15 months since 15 months they got stuck, that they have been on solid land. And now the question is, how can they reconnect with humanity? And so Shackleton and his 5 men set off in one of these lifeboats, leaving behind the rest of his crew. And they have a journey of 800 miles to cross. They set out, and immediately gales start up again. The navigator, Frank Worsley, has a single opportunity to take a reading off the sun, because the rest of the time it's so overcast. And by some miracle, he is able to guide the crew to South Georgia, this 800-mile journey. And as they come into the bay, on the wrong side, the opposite side of the island to the whaling station, the main pin holding the rudder in falls out, rendering the boat useless. They wouldn't be able to use it. It would have been, had they been at sea, they wouldn't have been able to direct themselves. And now they've got the problem that 3 of the men are too sick to travel any further. So Shackleton, and again, what is an astonishing act of amateurism, he's not a mountaineer, attempts to cross these glaciers and mountains to the whaling station.
He's a gentleman mountaineer.
He is from the finest tradition of enthusiastic amateurism. So the men, they twist screws into the bottom of their shoes. They have a bit of rope, a carpenter's adze, and they set off on this journey. And there's one particularly, I think, notable story where they're up at the top of a mountain and night is closing in, and they know that if they don't get down this mountain, they will die of exposure. And what they do is they coil the rope up into a rudimentary toboggan, wrap their arms around each other, and just launch themselves off into the void.
Right, and it must be very dark.
So they can't see, no sign, and if there is a cliff, they're dead. And yet, Shackleton has the most astonishing luck. There's a very good line written by a man who wasn't actually on the expedition with them, but writes afterwards about these 3 characters, Scott, Amundsen, and Shackleton. And he says, "For scientific discovery, give me Scott. For speed and efficiency of travel, give me Amundsen. But when disaster strikes and all hope is gone, get down on your knees and pray for Shackleton."
I like it.
And in this vein, he walks into the whaling station. Strides into the whaling station. And 16 months after they've got stuck. And there's a man there who he says, I'm Shackleton, don't you know me? And he says, I know your voice, but I don't recognize you. He's so changed by these experiences. And after that, it is then 3 more months before they're able to return on a ship of the Chilean navies to go down to Elephant Island and rescue their crew. And they hove into view. When Elephant Island hoves into view, they see a weak signal fire. And there's a question, how many of these men have survived? And the answer is all of them. All 22 men left behind have survived this wait, and they are all rescued from Elephant Island. And in that way, it is a disaster. The expedition is a disaster, but I think for me it is the most astonishing example of pluck and courage.
It is. And the International Court of Justice has a few criteria it looks at when it's apportioning sovereignty. And unfortunately, pluck isn't on that list. But the contention of the Anglofuturism podcast is that it should be taken into account. And we're going to return to this issue of sovereignty. But all this is to say that there is a magnificent history of British adventuring and pioneering in Antarctica. And so Shackleton's death in 1922, when he's, by kind of popular account, a broken man, does mark the end of the heroic age, but it does not mark the end of the exploration of Antarctica. And so from the 20s and 30s, you've got American explorers in early planes, like flying over parts of Antarctica. You've got a race to name different parts of the continent, because that's kind of the equivalent of putting your flag in the ground. It's the next best thing. Note that there's a bit of it now called Queen Elizabeth Land for similar reasons. So there's a German Antarctic expedition of 1939, and that drops, I'm sorry to say, metal swastikas over what is now Queen Maud Land, claimed for Nazi Germany, though listeners will be reassured to know that the area is now claimed by Norway.
That, I have to say, is not an example of pluck.
No, I think it's kind of cheesy if you were just dropping swastikas on it from above. Anyway, there's not much economic utility on Antarctica itself at this point.
What's the skiing like?
I mean, I think it was Shackleton who climbed Mount Erebus, which is a live volcano. I don't think it was like throwing out magma at that point. But theoretically, there could be very, very nippy skiing. But at that point, people don't care about skiing. They're more interested in whaling. And the sovereignty issue is a little more of an abstract thing because there's no real reason for it. Nevertheless, the US, which is becoming the most powerful country in the world, wants to retain the right to a slice. And in 1924, the Secretary of State says, "It is the opinion of this department that the discovery of lands unknown to civilization, even when coupled with a formal taking or possession, does not support a valid claim of sovereignty unless the discovery is followed by an actual settlement of the discovered country."
Sounds like something someone late to the party would say.
It does. It does. Someone late to the party and without a national history of pluck.
And what they then attempt to impose a settlement on Antarctica.
Well, not quite yet. There's still this chaotic state of proto-colonialism. In World War II, for instance, by the way, like very minor historical footnote, which is that this country called Argentina has been founded. And so the Argentinians and the Chileans also want a slice of Antarctica. And Argentina is allied with the Germans in World War II. And so Deception Island, which is this volcanic island just the north of the peninsula, that's
the end of the horseshoe crab's tail for those still keeping
the end of the horseshoe crab's tail,
keeping to our vertebrate-based metaphor.
And it's this incredible sort of black, grey, very dark island with like basically no life on it at all. Nevertheless, in World War II, it is the subject of a game of capture the flag, basically, between the Brits and the Argies. And so nobody wants to like actually leave troops stationed on it, but they both want it as guarding Drake's Passage, which is between the Antarctic and South America. And so the Argies turn up and they put their flag in it, and then the Brits turn up and they remove the flag, replace it with their own. I think this happens a few times over. The war eventually ends, and still nobody really owns the Antarctic, but everyone kind of wants at least a right to own some of it. And things hot up a little bit in 1952, and that's the point where there's a British meteorological party that lands at Hope Bay, which is on the northern end of this peninsula. And then the Argentine Navy turns up, and they use small arms fire to chase this meteorological party back to its ship. Not the last time that the Argies would intrude on peaceful British activity in this part of the world. Fortunately, the Argentinian government agreed not to interfere with the British scientists. But nevertheless, there is this growing international sense that order must be brought to the Antarctic at some point. Like the Soviets are interested, the Americans are interested. I think there's more of a sense at this point that there might be oil, gas, coal, good mining, all that kind of thing. And so a program of geophysical research is set up jointly by various countries in the late 50s. And then when that ends, In 1958, that leaves a bit of a legislative vacancy. And President Eisenhower fills that vacancy by brokering a treaty. And this is a very important treaty in the history of the Antarctic.
Well, this is the Antarctic Treaty that still binds us today, isn't it?
Yeah, it was an agreement between all the countries that were active on Antarctica at the time. So that's the RGs, Australia, Belgium, who we've mentioned.
Belgium is still relevant in this, are they?
Yeah, I mean, preposterously, yes, they are one of the 12 parties to this treaty. There's also Chile, France, Japan, New Zealand, Norway, South Africa, the Soviet Union, and then, of course, us and the US. And the treaty was signed on December the 1st, 1959, and enacted in 1961. And its objectives are to keep Antarctica demilitarized, to prevent these countries from using it as a place to test nukes, and to ensure that it is used for peaceful and scientific purposes only. And a few countries have been added. So if you have a long-term scientific commitment to Antarctica, you can be a consultative party. And so we've got like China and Iran involved, I think, for instance. But that's where we are now. We still have this treaty that prevents countries from militarizing Antarctica to doing anything really economic with it. But what's interesting, Calum, is that this treaty can be revised from 2048 onwards.
Right. So we're now staring down the end of what is potentially the sort of halcyon period of Antarctic quietude and peace. And now people are waking up to actually the resources and what this area has to offer.
Well, I think it's certainly fair to say that people are waking up to the potential wealth of the other polar region. And I'm thinking, of course, of Greenland, which the Trump administration has shown a lot of interest in buying. Trump wants to drill in Greenland. He wants to use it for strategic purposes. He sent his son, Donald Trump Jr., to Greenland recently, and he's trying to get them to vote for independence from Denmark. And so the Trump team sees a landmass rich in gas, oil, gold, and rare earth minerals. And as ice begins to melt, this stuff becomes more accessible.
Well, and it's not just the Americans who are looking, right? That Russians as well are searching under the Arctic for oil. I think there was a finding of these vast oil fields up in sort of underneath the ice, and the Chinese as well, I think, are excited by the opening of trade routes that emerge as the Arctic ice opens up, that you can start moving containers across the world without necessarily having to go through Suez or around the Cape.
Yeah, and I think Donald Trump has said that he wants to order 40 icebreakers, and the US Navy doesn't have any. We have one.
That's almost the two-power standard. But I think you're right, that we are now emerging back into a time of territorial expansion, of where the borders and the assumptions that what was once fixed on a map is now open to reevaluation, and it might be time to act on our own behalf.
Well, I spoke to a professor of geopolitics about this, a guy called Klaus Dodds, and I'll tell you what he said to me, which is that the Greenland saga is just a reminder that both the Arctic and Antarctic are no longer protected by what was until quite recently termed exceptionalism. And he said of Trump that he has not discovered Antarctica yet, but he might do so in his second term. And if he does, he will be briefed on the arrival of several more countries to Antarctica. So it's not just the Brits and like all those other countries like the Norwegians who maintain bases there. There's also an Indian base, Turkish base, Chinese bases. Even Iran has said that it wants an Antarctic base. And like I say, in 2048, any of the original 12 signatories to the treaty may request a conference to review the existing terms. So given the changing attitudes towards the polar regions, given this point at which the treaty can be reevaluated, and given some quite exciting evidence of mineral wealth, which we'll get to, this could be a very important era for the Antarctic. And we might find ourselves in a situation where we are looking back through history at the basis of our claim and looking at stories like Scott's and Shackleton's, and then thanking our lucky stars that they actually did do this exploration, because everyone's going to want a slice of the Antarctic.
Well, yeah, and you mentioned the mineral wealth. Our claim, I think, and maybe you talk more about it, is particularly vulnerable because the Chileans and the Argentinians' claims overlap our own, in that our claim, which is this end of this peninsula, the rocky and exposed bits, are actually in many ways quite an advantageous area to claim, because you don't have to dig through thick ice sheets. But it also is the area, unfortunately, that is closest to Argentina and Chile, and being willing to forcefully push our claim might be quite critical.
Listeners, we're going to leave you with that bombshell, but we'll be back after a break.
Hi, I'm Dr. Lawrence Spaceport. You might have heard of the Looking for Growth campaign, sometimes known as LFG. Well, I'm doing something even better. I present to you the LST bill. That's right, I'm looking for terraforming. Because in space, nobody can hear the NIMBYs scream. We will carpet Mars in power lines and Victorian mansion blocks, turning that rusty wilderness into a proper cosmic Kensington, complete with gas-lit craters and butler-operated elevators to Olympus Mons. It's already a planet free of XL bullies and excess zoning laws, but with your support, we can make it even better. Red Planet today, red tape never.
Welcome back, listeners. Tom is polishing off his third pint of gin and has spotted through the porthole a collection of 3 buildings that have got him rather excited. What are those, Tom?
Yeah, so what we've got below us, Calum, come have a look. It's Port Lockroy. And listeners, Port Lockroy is the main British outpost at the moment in Antarctica. And it's 3 buildings, the largest of which is Bransfield House, and that houses a post office, among other things. This is the UK's most southerly public post office, and it is also known as the Penguin Post Office.
Do you think it also stocks sort of crass birthday cards that you can send to your stepdad?
Yeah, I'm sure you can get your holiday travel insurance, and probably a bit expensive down there. And Port Lockroy is largely occupied by the British Antarctic Survey, and this is the organisation that conducts scientific work on behalf of the country in conjunction with other countries' polar operations. And I have an exciting update for listeners to the Anglo-Futurism podcast, which is that the British Antarctic Survey is hiring.
Exactly. So if you have always thought of yourself as a doer of daring do, and think that actually what Shackleton did sounds quite exciting, this is your chance.
Well, you can be an agricultural plant operator, or an agricultural plant mechanic, a glacier geophysicist, or more excitingly, unfortunately, this is a remote position, but you can currently apply to be an Antarctic Place Names Committee ad hoc member.
And what would this involve?
Well, you join a committee and then you just make up names for bits of the Antarctic. So we have a few suggestions. We propose the Duchy of Antarctica Mining Territory, for forbidden reasons that we'll refer to shortly, Snow on the Wold, New South Wales, and perhaps HMP Shackleton,
where we send everyone who plays TikToks on the bus.
They're all getting rounded up and they're all getting sent to HMP Shackleton, and they will regret every decibel of tube music that they inflict on us.
So, Tom, other than the ability to send postcards home to your loved ones, what else is there in Antarctica, and what are these people actually doing other than looking at plants?
Well, a lot of their work is to do with the climate. But as regards your first question, not only can you send a smutty postcard from the Antarctic, you might also be able to get filthy rich, because this is a geologically very interesting part of the world. And so, as listeners will remember, this is a peninsula. And it's a peninsula that is rocky. It's got exposed rock, so it's not covered by like a kilometre of ice, as most of the continent is. And because you're not allowed to mine there, we don't know a ton about what's going on geologically in Antarctica. But there are some clues. And one of the clues comes from the geological composition of other continents, which used to be part of this huge continental landmass called Gondwana, that Antarctica was once a part of as well.
Gondwana? I hardly know it.
Brilliant, thank you, Calum. The peninsula seems to have some shared history with South America, and the kind of rock it is suggests that there might be quite significant gold deposits, which is very exciting. There's there's visible copper staining on these rocks. That's definitely not worth going all the way to the Antarctic to mine for, but the gold might be. Right, so we've got copper, which is not very exciting, gold, which could definitely be exciting, and incidentally, in the New Zealand's part of Antarctica, there is a volcano that spews gold. I'm not making this up. It's just like very obviously very expensive to get to, but it spews gold dust.
I like the idea. I like the idea of an Antarctic-based or localized gold rush, in which you swing open the salon doors and you walk in with your 900. the wind whistling underneath the salon doors. Actually, you can't have any decent gunfights because you can't find your ammunition tucked in one of your pockets.
But there'll be more than a gold rush. There could be a uranium rush. There could be a diamond-bearing rock rush, because both of those have been found in Antarctica. So you've got potentially this colossal mineral wealth. Bear in mind that our slice is 8 times the size of Great Britain, as I said. And so your odds are pretty good of finding some good stuff, quite apart from these clues which we already have. One final clue is the presence of active volcanoes in the British Antarctic Territory. And they're exciting because they bring metals to the surface. They're often very valuable. I remember a geologist at Oxford once telling me every volcano has underneath it tens of millions of pounds of precious metals. And if they're active, then so much the better. And crucially, the British territory has several of these. So, like I say, it could make us extremely rich.
But Tom, gold and diamonds are only the tip of the iceberg, are they not?
They are only the tip of the iceberg. Thank you, Calum. They are the tip of the iceberg because there's also a lot of fuel there. And this Russian crew found huge reserves of oil and gas in, I think, the Weddell Sea just off the peninsula. Specifically, what that crew found was apparently reserves of oil and gas that in total are 10 times larger than our entire North Sea output over the past half century.
And I think, Tom, many a green voting pensioner might at this point pop up and say, this is awful. The idea that we would ruin one of the last undamaged environments or habitats in the world, and would be frankly appalled by our glee at the thought of nodding donkeys studying the landscape. Is this a problem? Is there a risk of us damaging the environment by doing this?
Well, I think there's a lot you can say in response to that question. And I think, frankly, some people are misguided in their views of the Antarctic. As we know, British energy is incredibly expensive. It's 4 times more expensive than American energy, for instance. We're still using gas.
Forms the baseload power. And as we bring online more and more intermittent renewables, the vital necessity of having these oil and gas and sometimes even coal baseload power supplies is ever more clear.
Well, I think it's important to make a distinction between coal, which is very dirty, and natural gas, which is less dirty. It's also important to remember that we really should be using nuclear as our baseload, but for various avoidable reasons, we're not. And so we're in this position where we just need a stopgap, and we're buying this stopgap from other people anyway. So while I'm more excited about the mining, I think the oil and gas is potentially a pretty valuable resource as well. And when people talk about the pristineness of the Antarctic, I think that's true. But you've got to bear in mind that although there's lots of marine life at the bottom of the ocean, there is almost nothing that can live on Antarctica itself. And my view is that if we're going to be mining and extracting resources, this is the best place in the world. It's not the worst, it's the best. And the reason is that there's so little ecology to interfere with. Bear in mind that it's a totally inhospitable part of the world. It's dark for about 6 months, and so you get very limited opportunity to photosynthesize. So there are hardly any plants. There are only about 800 species of Antarctic plants, of which 350 are lichens. And you're certainly not getting rid of all the lichens by doing a bit of mining in like one part of this massive continent. And then, maybe people are wondering about animals. Well, it's mice. It's mites, not mice, but mites, lice, midges, fleas, tardigrades.
A species known for their ability to survive in outer space, so probably won't be bothered by a mine being built next to them.
Yeah, I think they'll muddle through. And we've got the penguins, of course, and we should look after these penguins. But these are not the penguins of yore. In the good old days, 30 million years ago, the Antarctic penguins were 2 meters tall. They were 2 meters tall, and they were not even the biggest animal on the Antarctic. This is a tangent now, but I think it's worth it because there was this flightless carnivorous bird that stood 3.5 meters tall that could run through the forest on the hunt. And bear in mind, it would have been dark for 6 months per year.
So probably had quite a strong forehead that able to resist bashing into things as it ran.
Or like infrared vision or something. We don't know. So this stuff would have been like charging through these forests that would eventually become like British oil. It's like totally fantastic. But those days are long gone and none of it is left. And
so, Tom, what you're saying is the degradation of the penguin species means they're deserving of extinction at this point.
That is not what I'm saying. I think in a nutshell, my claim is that this is the least bad place in the world for certain forms of industrial activity. So, as we've explained, this part of the world could be this bonanza of resources. And it's worth recalling something that Cook wrote, which is that should anyone possess the resolution and fortitude to elucidate this point by pushing yet further south than I have done, I shall not envy him the fame of his discovery, but I make bold to declare that the world will derive no benefit from it. He could not have been more wrong. And that's proven by the number of pairs of covetous eyes that are now falling on our British slice of the Antarctic. And so you can put a research station wherever you like on the Antarctic. And that means that on the peninsula, there are several other bases. And so these come from places like Argentina, of course, but also Brazil, Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, blah, blah, blah. All these countries, even Peru, Poland, Spain.
Not natural cold weather people, folk.
No. With none of this fantastic history of exploration. And as we were saying, times are changing. Countries are waking up to the potential of the polar regions. And again, I was speaking to Bob Seeley, who was formerly a member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, about the British Antarctic Territory when I was writing about it for The Telegraph. And he told me, the weaker we look, the more we become a target. I think we are entering a period of world history whereby liberal internationalism is going to come under a lot of pressure from hard realist power.
And I think this is why we drew the parallel, right, to the Chagos Islands, in that countries that are willing to pull whatever levers they can, be that anti-colonialism, be that right, be that proximity, like what the Argentinians have done with regards to the Falkland Islands. Nations that are willing to push will reap the rewards of their efforts. And it will require us being forceful in the defense of our possessions to maintain sort of the control, but also maintain the benefits of this land.
Yeah, I think it might well be a use it or lose it situation. And it will almost certainly be a situation where those who benefit are those who are most entrepreneurial and assertive about it. Listeners might remember that we had Samo Buya on the pod, and he's the geopolitical analyst from Bismarck, and he said that Antarctica is one of many unique opportunities left in the world, and a country like Britain should not be playing it safe. We should be taking advantage of amazing possessions like this.
And I think this brings us on quite nicely to the threats and the countries who might be willing to push their claims or a claim at the expense of Britain. So you mentioned these other countries that maintain research stations. At the moment, the territories look a bit like a pie sliced up, right? With sort of slices cut out reaching towards the South Pole. What would an effort to solidify and support our claim look like?
It's very hard to predict what will become of the Antarctic. It might just be that the US and China carve it up somehow. There's this Transantarctic line of mountains that could package it. I think if we're actually serious about making the most of it, then we might need to be doing a little bit more. And in the course of this journalism I did on the BAT for the Telegraph, I spoke to a guy called Dryden Brown, and he's an American who has $20 million worth of Silicon Valley funding to build an independent libertarian city called Praxis. And he proposed that the British government, work with him to develop Antarctica. And he wanted to build geodesic domes, which are hemispherical structures that can house humans in harsh environments, on the British Antarctic Territory. And what's cool about that is that it would be piloting technology that we would need to settle on the Moon and Mars. So it's a great scientific endeavor. And because it's scientific rather than militaristic or extractive, it could, in theory, be within the rules of the treaty. And I think if you start putting domes down and making a serious fist of settling it, then your claim becomes stronger. Your claim becomes stronger, and you learn about the environment as well. You could start just finding out what resources there are, such that you're in pole position to claim them when it becomes legal. And perhaps more fundamentally than that, we would be continuing this noble history of exploring Antarctica and pushing the frontier as far as we can.
The point there is people are already planning. There are already entrepreneurial efforts in mind. And as with Columbus, who was initially turned away by the King of Portugal and then went to Spain and then went and found the New World, there are enthusiastic, motivated and driven individuals who are going to go and take advantage of this. And the question is, are we going to be the ones backing them, or are we going to be, in 50 years' time, looking back and thinking, oh gosh, what a missed opportunity?
Absolutely. And if you think that China hasn't got a plan for the Antarctic when they put all these bases down on it, you're a moron. Like, of course they have a plan. Other countries are thinking what they're going to do with the Antarctic. We should be thinking about it too. And the potential is immense.
So, Tom, as a man who has spent the last few weeks with his head in a freezer trying to simulate the conditions or the experiences of a future British Antarctic Territory colonist, what sort of things might a futuristic and patriotic British colony look like?
Okay, let me paint you a picture, Calum. Close your eyes and imagine the gently nodding pump jack of the Royal Antarctic oil fields. To their north, a busy new harbour straddled by the mighty granite figure of the Scott Colossus, populated by humanoid mining robots. And finally, the king inspecting the first gold coin to emerge from the Antarctic Mint, just before he visits a vast data centre that is cooled by the snow and supported against the Antarctic gales by cathedral-style flying buttresses.
It would be quite a notable event, because always the gold in the royal jewellery has always come from Wales, right? What a declaration of intent to take gold from Antarctica.
Oh, hugely. And then, as well as taking things to the Antarctic and bringing them home, we could send some things there from here. So to make it truly British, we would have the Port Lockroy Greggs. We could have like a Casper's ice cream in Port Lockroy as well. We could have delivery dark kitchens and riders on skidoos, and a statue, of course, of Edward Bransfield.
Edward Bransfield with some face.
The faceless statue.
Reconstructed from his descendants as a sort of a e-fit. However, it seems to me that the FCDO is not thinking about this. As you say, China has a plan. We don't have a plan.
Yeah, well, I think it's difficult for us to know what is going on inside the FCDO. It certainly seems that there's a relaxed attitude towards our continued possession of things we picked up in the 19th century and beyond. I did ask the FCDO, and, well, I'll read you the statement. They said, the Antarctic Treaty, which has been in place since 1959, strictly reserves the use of Antarctic territories for scientific use only. The UK remains staunchly committed to this and to the sovereignty of the British Antarctic Territory. And that statement is all very well, but you've got to take it in context with the size of the Navy at the moment, which seems no longer adequate to protect that passage between Scotland and Iceland into the Atlantic, which might be partly why Trump wants to buy Greenland. So, unfortunately, I don't think we're particularly well placed right now to defend our claim.
And I think this is a particularly critical moment, right? Because we are moving now from a world where we could peacefully expect a US-backed Pax Americana and an American hegemon who would not use their power to extract sort of, well, maybe not extract, but not extract too many concessions from its vassal powers. And we are now moving into a time when America wants to start throwing its weight around. And the question is, are we going to wait for things to happen to us and accept that America is no longer following the rules that it set up in the middle of the 20th century and that China is growing ever more muscular in its attitudes? Or are we going to accept the world coming to us? Or are we going to take active steps to make the world one that is favourable and friendly to the British people?
Well, on that note, Aris Roussenos, who's an unheard writer who's been talking about Anglo-futurism longer than we have, wrote recently about all these other possessions that Britain has scattered across the globe. So Chagos, but also Falklands, South Georgia, and Roussenos compares Britain to this bedridden aunt who is sitting on this incredible property portfolio, also including these Caribbean islands as well, and not quite knowing what to do with it. And the problem with being a vulnerable, bedridden old aunt who doesn't know what to do with her property portfolio is that someone else might take it off you.
Chinese wolf in sheep's clothing.
The Chinese wolf in sheep's clothing. And so we have this situation now where the Falklands government, which is somewhat autonomous from His Majesty's government, is authorising oil and gas drilling, which we won't benefit from because Labour doesn't allow it. There's another world in which we're making the most of these resources rather than giving them away to someone. I mean, there's another world where instead of simply giving away this oil and gas, we use it productively. We encourage young Brits, as Roussenos suggests, to settle the Falklands. We make holiday resorts out of the Chagos Islands.
Well, and allow the Chagosians to benefit as a result.
Yeah. And crucially, if we make the most of Antarctica, then we are giving ourselves the tools of the prosperity that we'll need to defend ourselves from these covetous other countries and to hold on to what we've got.
Well, and also to push for net zero, right? That, I think, is an undervalued point, that at the moment we cannot power the country purely on solar and wind power. At the moment, we are still using fossil fuels. We would like to move to a world of fusion, of more nuclear. At the moment, we can't do it because we're not rich enough. At the moment, we have the two most expensive nuclear power plants. If we want to keep building nuclear power plants at this extortionate cost and extortionate markup compared to the rest of the world, the money for it is going to have to come from somewhere. And this seems as good a place as any to drive us forward into a new century of growth, powered, as the boom years after Thatcher, many would claim, were driven by the discovery of North Sea oil. We too could have this kind of economic growth.
We started this episode by talking about Scots and Shackleton, and I think what's really noble about them is how they are pushing the frontier, pushing into the unknown, and that's something that we don't really do as a country anymore. But if we start settling the Antarctic and prospecting it and finding incredible resources there and developing technology that humans might one day use on the moon and Mars, then I think that will be a fitting tribute to them rather than just letting someone else take all this land off us.
And on that note, Tom, I suggest we return to sunnier climes as the portholes are starting to get a bit icy. Tom, where can listeners who are interested in this find out more information? Well,
we'll put a link or two in the show notes. One final thing before we let you all go.
For our solid, salt-of-the-earth yeoman listeners, we encourage you, please, to like, subscribe, and share the podcast with their friends. For our patrician listeners, on the other hand, we invite you to consider supporting us to help us produce these episodes at an even greater clip in order to bring about the next British century a little faster. With that, we'll sign off. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.
We hope to see you at the Port Lockroy Greggs. Goodbye.